So we talked about the 80s, we talked about the 90s, we talked about the 2000s and the 2010s. Now let's get into the rock and roll decade that is the 1970s. Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Nick here from the Lost River Drive-In, and today we are going to go through the 1970s, the decade in horror, and give my favorite horror movie from each year in that decade. Now, this is not as entry-level as some of the other decades. Everybody thinks of the 80s to now. There were a lot of movies in the 70s, a lot of horror movies. It was a very different decade for horror, at least the first half of it. There are a lot of deep cuts here that a lot of you probably haven't seen, myself included. So some of these years are really easy for me, and some of them are more difficult. But starting off with 1970, my favorite horror movie of that year is Count Dracula. Now, this is not a Hammer film, but it's very much in line with the Hammer films of that era that you got. Obviously, this is Christopher Lee as Dracula, and I think he's great in the role. This movie, however, is definitely not the best Dracula film that he did. It is a bit more B-movie-ish, it's a bit more low budget, it's got a really good cast, and there's a lot of cool ideas on screen. They just didn't really have the money and maybe the ambition to achieve what they were trying to. Having said that, the early 70s, it was difficult for me because there's a lot I really haven't seen. This one I have seen, though, being a big fan of Christopher Lee because of his work as Count Dooku. So 1970 for me is going to go to Count Dracula. Now we've reached 1971, and my pick from 1971 is a movie that I just saw for the first time a couple of years ago, and that's called Let's Scare Jessica to Death. Now, I had heard about this movie before, but I had never seen it. I went and watched this movie because Scream Factory actually came out with a special edition release of this a few years back, and I actually really enjoyed this movie. It plays more like a mystery and at times a deconstruction of and a commentary on mental health. It's about a recently institutionalized woman, played by Zora Lampert, by the way, who believes after moving into this supposedly haunted house that she's going crazy again, seeing things, hearing things, and it's actually a really intriguing movie. Now, I feel like mid to late 70s is really where my sweet spot is, but this is an early gem from the early 1970s that I actually think stands out quite a bit. And if you're into that kind of like mystery paranormal side of things, while also a deconstruction of mental health problems, I think you'll really like this movie. Now in the year 1972 is probably a name that's familiar to you guys, but you're probably thinking of something else, and that is Tales from the Crypt. Now, this is probably the first horror anthology I ever saw at a very young, impressionable age. My grandpa used to watch stuff black and white all the time. He actually still does, as an almost 90-year-old man, Old dog, can't teach him new tricks. And I remember watching this movie, and I can't remember exactly if it was there or if it was at home and I caught it on late night TV, but I remember it was really freaky. Even though some of the effects and some of the, acting is over the top and kind of shoddy at times, there's this, uniqueness, and it just makes me feel good watching it. It's kind of weird. I don't know. Transports me back to that place in time. Also, it has the immortal Peter Cushing in this. Now, again, this is an anthology, so it's 5 stories in one film. And I cannot stress enough, if you're not really a fan of older horror, you probably want to go for the, more recent adaptations of Tales from the Crypt, namely the TV series. But there was a movie in 1972 starring Peter Cushing that is just really kind of cheap fun, and I enjoy it quite a bit. Now in the year 1973, this should come as no surprise to anybody. If you know anything about me, it is The Exorcist. Guys, I have gone on record as saying that I think The Exorcist is the greatest horror film ever made, if not the most consequential and important horror film ever made, at the very least. It is not my favorite horror movie ever made. That is obviously Halloween. But The Exorcist, I think, is absolutely so important to cinema and where horror is today and why I got into horror in the first place that I cannot deny that it is a high point, if not the highest point in the genre. Look, we can go on and on about the great performances in this movie. We can go on and on about how a lot of people at the time really thought this was real, and it kind of spooked an entire nation, if not the world. This movie was a phenomenon, and even 50 plus years later, it still is. You mentioned The Exorcist, everybody knows what it is. I would argue Tubular Bells is as iconic as the Halloween theme. This movie changed the world, in my opinion, and I think that Friedkin's directing in this film is all time, top notch. Some of the ways they went about getting some of these shots was insane. This was before Steadicams. This was before you could really do a lot of what you could have done 5 years later. This movie was revolutionary, and I cannot get through the year 1973 without just saying it's obviously hands down The Exorcist. We don't even need to talk anymore. Now we've reached the year 1974, and I know a lot of you guys think you know where I'm going with this one, but I'm not. So, I'll give a shout out first to Tobe Hooper's immortal classic, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which I feel like is immensely consequential to the slasher craze that would happen just a few years later. Having said that, it's Black Christmas for me. Look, I don't know what else to say about this movie. This movie, in my opinion, is all that in a bag of chips. It's incredible. I remember growing up and being in love with Halloween and having never seen the original Black Christmas. And I think Halloween is the movie that really made me just love the idea of horror films set around holidays. Well, look no further than Black Christmas, because I don't know if there's a better Christmas horror film. I actually would say there isn't. This movie is equally effective. It's got some funny moments. It's got a nice, cast here and camaraderie between them. Some nice surprises and surprisingly some gross shit for a 1974 movie. Some of the things that the caller says on the phone are just like, ugh, gross. Now, you guys know I love the '06 movie, but it's for totally different reasons. This movie, just as a work of suspense and terror and dread and fear, It nails it. This is an incredible holiday horror film, and I think Halloween owes a lot to this movie. The year is 1975, and as if there were any doubt, it's Jaws. I mean, come on. Jaws terrified generations, and will terrify generations to come. It made all of us at some point when we were younger scared of bodies of water, even if they were fresh bodies of water. Even if it was a pool that was just a little too deep. You were worried about Bruce coming up and biting your leg off. Jaws is one of those films that I feel like is going to live on forever. I don't think it's ever going to drop in popularity. I don't think it's ever going to not be effective. Because this was a practically done movie that was directed incredibly well by Spielberg. And just, it oozes Americana, I guess is a way to put it. This movie is Americana. Going to the beach and spending time with friends and family. And it's summertime and it's all great. And there's a giant ass shark eating people. I mean, like, what else do you want? This movie was so important to how we just view sharks today. We fear shark attacks, I think, because of Jaws. Sure, nobody wants to get eaten by a shark. But Jaws changed the frickin' game. And I feel like if any movie gets put over Jaws in 1975, what are we doing here? Now we've reached 1976, and I want to give a shout out to The Omen. Although it is not one that I have adored my entire life, it's a really solid movie, and I think it's super important in horror history. But 1976 goes to Carrie for me. Look, this was a movie my mom talked up so much when I was a kid. She was a big Stephen King fan, so this was a movie that was kind of on constant rotation in our house. We always watched this movie. Anytime it was on TV, my mom would quote it because the movie is just quotable. I mean, if you've seen the movie, you know that. Carrie is a great movie. It really is. And it's probably one of Stephen King's finer works as a novel as well. Having read the novel, I like the differences that De Palma has from the novel. And I think that De Palma's directing style, to some it's really jarring. I get that. And at times it even was for me. But I think it sets it apart from a lot of the Stephen King adaptations. And you can just know, oh, that's Carrie. That is just Carrie. You remember Carrie. There are images and moments from this movie that will be burned into your memory forever. So 1976 was a year that I had a few good horror films, but I gotta go Carrie here, guys. 1977 brought us the immortal classic, Exorcist II, The Heretic. Nah, I'm just kidding, that movie blows. No, the year 1977 belonged to House. Now, I gotta give a shout out to my buddy Ken from Sledgehammer Horror. This is his favorite movie of all time. And I can understand why, because This movie as a child scared the crap out of me. Now, going back and watching the movie now, I have a really good time with it. I don't understand why I ever found it scary when I was a kid. But this movie was one of those movies that was really effective. And it was also one that I was always seeing played on late night TV. It is just one of those movies that I feel like once you see it, you're never going to forget House. For good or bad. I know there are people on sides of the fence here that are either, oh, I love this movie, I adore it, or I hate this movie, it's trash. And guess what? If a movie can elicit either extreme reaction from someone, you're doing something right. So, 1977 belonged to House. 1978. It's Halloween. I mean, come on. It's Halloween. Look, you guys know how big of a fan of the Halloween franchise I am, and how important this series, and specifically this movie, is to me. This movie is everything to me. It is the reason why I collect films. It's the reason why I love horror films as much as I do. I owe everything to Halloween. Now, I know that's weird to say, right? How can you owe something to a movie that you had nothing to do with? You know what? Shut up, okay? We all have that movie, or that album, or that song, or whatever it is, that we're just like, you complete me. You are me. You are an extension of me. You're everything that's right in the world. And that's what Halloween is. Guys, I said earlier with 1974 that Black Christmas, I think, pioneered a lot of what became super popular and really into the zeitgeist in Halloween. Guys, I said before, Black Christmas is really responsible for Halloween, I believe. And I think that Halloween took what Black Christmas did and did it better. And part of that was advancements in technology. Look no further than the Steadicam. That is why we got that incredible opening tracking shot of, yes, the infamous "there is a cut in it" moment. But Halloween was just, I feel like if Black Christmas had come like 4 or 5 years later, it might be better in my opinion than Halloween. But Halloween came at the right time, it had the right people behind it, and it has spawned such a massively important franchise that I don't think is ever going to die, and I don't ever want it to die. So as if there were any friggin' doubt, come on, it's Halloween. And rounding out the decade in the year 1979, the winner is Alien. Look, I know Aliens isn't really that much of a horror film, and I know the series definitely kind of dipped more into sci-fi action, but Alien is a horror film. And the idea that you are out floating in space, and no one can hear you scream, and no one's coming to save you, and you are under attack from creatures from outer space with acidic blood, face huggers that can lock onto your face and put a baby into your stomach and have it burst out of your chest, and there's nothing you can do. Go down the freaking list of why this movie is horrifying. If you're claustrophobic, if isolationism is something that really freaks you out, if the desolate loneliness and nothingness of space and being trapped somewhere with no outlet for safety is something that scares you, look no further than Alien. Ridley Scott's Alien is one of the greatest horror films ever frickin' made. And this movie, even today, as an almost 30-year-old man, I can watch this movie and moments just give me the freaking heebie-jeebies. There's something about this movie that I feel like is going to remain effective for all time. So don't sit here and argue with me. Don't say Alien's not a horror movie, because you are 110% wrong as shit. Alien's a horror film, and it's the greatest one from 1979. So that was the 1970s, going through each year of the decade and picking my favorite horror film from it. Now, I know for a lot of you guys, there was probably some movies I mentioned that you were like, I've never heard of this one or seen it. I will say, some of them, mainly at the beginning of the 70s, they're not some of my favorites, and it was really slim pickings, but I had to pick one. And I would say that every single one I picked is one I would genuinely recommend. So if there are some you guys haven't seen or haven't heard of, I implore you guys to check them out. A lot of them are on Tubi. A lot of these older horror movies are. And that's a free app. You don't have to sign up for shit. You might have to watch a couple ads, but whatever. But I want to hear down below what your guys' favorite horror movies from each year of the 1970s are below. Comment down below, leave a like on the video, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. This is Nick at the Lost River Drive-In, and I am pulling out.